This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include Connie Wilson, former legislator, Director of NC Policy Watch, Chris Fitzsimon, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, and former Senator and former Chairman of the State Board of Education, Howard Lee. We got a good show for you this week, hotter than the July temperatures. We begin with the last word on the legislative session that recently concluded. We'll discuss the latest maneuvers in legislative redistricting and whether or not special elections will be held. Plus, we'll debate whether or not our state is making an economic U-turn. And as always, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. The dust is settled from the recently concluded legislative session, and we want our panel to give their conclusions. Howard Lee, every session seems to have a theme. Many are saying the theme this session was the battle between Governor Cooper and the legislature. Would you agree, or if not, what would you say it was?
Well, I certainly think that tug of war dominated the headlines in many ways and over many issues. However, my theme that I've attached to the legislature is one that centers around tax cuts. It centers around budget reductions. And of course, it centers around being able to shrink things in such a way that we are able to.
Oh, wait a minute, that's not fair. That's not one theme, that's three or four. John, what would you say your theme was?
Well, I do think the theme is the conflict between Governor Cooper and the legislature, but it's really a subset because the theme is the Republicans have been in power in the legislature since the 2010 elections. They have more or less conveyed and acted on a particular conservative policy course. I think the big question in 2017 was, could the election of a Democratic governor put a significant check on what the Republicans have been doing steadily over the years? And the answer so far is no.
Chris, you've written about this quite a bit. Yeah. What would you say the theme was?
Well, unfortunately, I think part of it was vindictiveness. I actually think the session started in the special session that was, remember, unannounced, called at the last minute to take powers away from the governor, everything from appointing trustees and boards of universities to confirming his appointments and a lot of other things. And the session ended, remember, with a budget that cut $1 million almost out of the governor's budget, that forced the Attorney General to fire 123 lawyers, which protect, most of them work in law enforcement, appellate decisions. And so I think and I should add, the Republicans abandoned their conservative principles and divided up $100 million money in secret to their own legislative districts.
All right. Now, like Howard, I'm not sure I'm getting.
Well, I think it's primarily vindictiveness and pettiness. They got money for their districts. They punished the governor in the budget, and they punished the people of North Carolina by firing lawyers in the AG's office.
Connie Wilson, tell us what the dominant theme of this legislative session was.
The dominant theme is when there's a Democratic governor, the Republicans treat each other nicer in the General Assembly. And that's why we were able to get out by June 30th. It was an unusual session for pace. We really had very few weeks where there was a lot of legislation moving, but there was a lot that moved during those weeks.
Sort of a steady flow.
It was frustrating for a lot of legislators because they came up, there weren't committee meetings, there weren't bills moving, but eventually they got everything done.
All right, the legislature put aside money for the next rainy day, gave teachers, principals, state employees pay raises, and retirees of cost of living increase. Then they repealed sort of HB 2. What other big legislation would you say this session passed, Howard?
Well, I certainly think those are the main pieces that I saw that I felt good about. And but beyond that, I can't think of anything that stands out.
Well, there's a big environmental bill that passed, energy bill that passed, that had to do with changes to how particularly solar energy contracts are done. North Carolina was a bit of an outlier in what amounts to a federal program to buy in over many years some solar contracts. That was changed. What made that controversial is what was added to that was a moratorium on windmills, on wind turbines.
Right.
And that is what raises the question of whether Governor Cooper will sign it.
Veto it.
Previously, there had been a lot of support for the bill among industry, environmental groups, Republicans and Democrats, but then that was added, so we'll have to see if it actually sticks.
Chris, there was a lot of stuff left undone, and one thing that was a bit unusual was that when they adjourned, they announced they were going to reconvene August 3rd,
right,
and then again September 3rd.
Right.
What's left to be done there?
Well, they're going to have to decide whether or not to override vetoes by Governor Cooper. There are a couple of those, and there may be more. He is considering vetoing the energy bill because of the wind moratorium, which, by the way, the General Assembly said it would hurt military bases, even though the military said it wouldn't hurt military bases. They're also going to have to come back and draw new districts, remember, and we're going to talk about that. But the court has said the districts, legislative districts, run constitutionally racially gerrymandered, so we have to redraw new legislative districts.
And Connie, can we expect, Chris raised the subject of redistricting, we are going to talk about that later, but do you think the bill is going to resurface on redistricting the judicial districts and the districts for the districts attorney during perhaps one of these special sessions?
It is eligible. And so anything that's eligible, there's always a possibility. I think it would take some work behind the scenes to get that support level. I just also wanted to mention that this session, the bill to raise the age for children, as how they're treated as criminals, a huge piece of legislation went through this year, and I think almost, it may have been unanimously. So there have been several pieces of good work that have passed.
John, we saw several protests again this session, and a Wake County magistrate banned 32 people from the legislature. NAACP President William Barber has announced this past week he's suing to have this overturned. What chances do you give this lawsuit?
Well, as we speak, Tom, we don't yet know the judge's ruling, but I think that the viewers might already know it. But I gather that neither side is going to get entirely what they want. The judge seems to have said that the magistrate's reaction to Reverend Barber and the others consistently breaking the law, by the way, not just talking in the legislature, but consistently, clearly and explicitly breaking the law many times in order to get arrested. The magistrate was banning them from the building altogether. The judge seemed to think that was too broad and was perhaps coming up with a more tailored response.
Chris, there was another interesting story. The legislature passed some new laws regarding economic incentives for businesses and industry to locate in North Carolina, particularly the big elephants, businesses that would invest more than $2 billion and 5,000 jobs and so forth like that. But after the announcement this past week about 2,000 jobs coming to Wake County from Infosys, some of the Republican legislators are now backing away from that, aren't they?
Well, they're saying they want some guarantee. Infosys, by the way, has said they're going to hire American workers or North Carolina workers. They're not going to use foreign workers in these jobs. I think that's what the legislators are worried about. But, you know, the Republican Party, for the most part, has had a philosophy that incentives are bad until they got in power, and now it looks like incentives are good.
Well, I think that's the same thing that's happened to everybody that's been in office, is that you
very
don't like
difficult across the country, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, they often criticize incentives when they're out of office, then they tend to sort of come to the conclusion they're inevitable. I would observe that we are giving less incentive. We've definitely moved away from the larger tax credit type incentives that used to be North Carolina's tool. We moved away from that. That's good.
Well, have you signed up to receive our free weekly email newsletter, Spin Cycle? It's easy to do. Just go to our website, ncspin.com, and sign up. And while you're there, you can view the latest NC Spin show, get video footage and perspective pieces not seen anywhere else, and read my weekly column. Get more balanced debate for the Old North State at ncspin.com, NC Spin on YouTube, or on Twitter at NC Spin Tweets. When we come back, we're going to talk about the judges hearing arguments on legislative redistricting.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The North Carolina General Assembly recently gave state retirees a well-deserved cost of living increase. Now local governments across North Carolina need to follow the legislature's lead and include retiree cost of living increases in their budgets. These increases are long overdue and desperately needed by all our retirees. The legislature heard us, and they did what's right. It's time for local governments to do the same. Learn more at ncrgea.com.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
We now return to C-SPAN.
A three-judge panel heard arguments as to whether to demand new legislative districts be redrawn and special elections held this year. Legislative lawyers claim such an action would require them to reconfigure 65% of the legislative districts, and special elections would cost the state $20 million. Connie, lawyers for both the Attorney General and the legislature appeared to kind of discourage holding special elections this year. Many are speculating the lawmakers may have already drawn those districts. Whether true or not, isn't it correct to say that with the new technologies, this could be rapidly and easily accomplished?
Well, it's not the technology that's an issue, but it's garnering support from within their majority caucuses and also within the minority caucus members. So this is more than just how you color in a map, but it's also how you work within the General Assembly, and that takes a little bit longer.
Chris, the lawmakers, when they went before the court, said that one way or the other they would have these maps drawn before November. My question is, was this just a sort of a stalling tactic on their behalf to try to get the judges to lean away from special elections?
I think the goal is to do everything they can to prevent special elections and wait until the 2018 election. But, you know, if that happens, maybe we don't have time, maybe we don't, that means we'll have had, you know, illegally racially gerrymandered districts for virtually this entire decade. And the message to me is the next time you draw districts, it's worth a shot at breaking the law and then stalling as long as you can to stay in power, even if you violate the Constitution. We've got to stop this insane process that we used to draw these legislative districts. And I think everybody in Raleigh knows they've drawn the districts. Clearly they have them. They just haven't released them. They may be fine-tuning them to help one incumbent or another, but they have the districts.
John, what problems, with what Chris said, what problems would occur if the court said that a new election must be held prior to the start of the short session next year?
Well, there are, of course, practical problems. You'd have low voter turnout, most likely, because it wouldn't be a traditional time. You would have 3 elections for the legislature within 3 years. Keep in mind that most North Carolina voters voted for people in districts that are not unconstitutional. So you will be actually yanking members that were constitutionally elected under the new Supreme Court decision. You'll be yanking people's vote that they cast in good faith for people whose districts have not been struck down. There are real costs associated. Now, again, as Chris gets at, there are also costs associated with the current system, but I would take strong exception to the initial point. They did not draw the districts in 2011 knowingly violating any kind of law or constitution. They were following Supreme Court precedent at the time. Absolutely explicit precedent from a North Carolina case about the 50% plus one type of standard. That was then overturned by a Supreme Court that was hopelessly divided. Remember, Clarence Thomas didn't say the legislature did race too much and they should do it a little bit less. He said they shouldn't have any race-conscious districts. This is just still murky.
Howard, regarding the possibility of special elections this year, the feeling was that the voice that legislators made was that if they had to have special elections this year, they'd have to have 3 elections between now and the next regularly scheduled election cycle. You've run for office several times before. How difficult of this, how problematic is that?
Well, I think it's a serious problem to try and put together a campaign, especially at the point we are right now, to have an election this year. I think the efforts and energy should be concentrated on hopefully getting the correctly drawn districts and then putting energies toward having an election in 2018. And I hear what Chris is saying, and he's correct about having served in a way that may not be totally correct, but at the same time, if we can get ourselves restarted again and do it right, and stop playing 4 corners.
Stalls, okay? Connie, one of the things that would come up, regardless of when we have, if we have elections sometime later this year or next year, is that Governor Cooper hasn't appointed new members to the State Board of Elections and Ethics Commission. Why is this the case, and what impact is it having?
It's basically the governor playing with the legislature a game of chicken, because they have their lawsuit over the combining of the Ethics Commission and the Elections Board, and it's almost as if the governor is condoning that merger if he appoints the members. But it's which comes first, the chicken or the egg. If you don't make those appointments, there's all these other requirements with the courts and the legislative redistricting, and now you get down to the county level, to the county boards of elections.
But if you do make the appointments, it's hard to take somebody off.
That's exactly right. Position. So, I mean, it could possibly hurt his standing in the case. So it's truly a problem where the voters are the ones who are going to lose.
John, the NAACP and the plaintiffs in this case have asked this three-judge panel to move quickly and rule quickly, regardless of what they rule, whether the legislative districts have to be redrawn right away in elections this year or not. When do you expect we might hear a ruling from these panels?
No, I think that the three-judge panel will act as quickly. We already know what they want to do. They were simply ordered to think more carefully about the consequences of their actions. I'm not sure it will change, and then it'll get appealed back to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, you talk about change, Chris. The legislative leaders, the Speaker and the President Pro Tem of the Senate, appointed the same chairs for redistricting that they had in 2011. So does that tell you we're probably going to see more gerrymandered districts?
Well, I'm sure we'll see more gerrymandered districts. And the question is, will they be constitutional? Will the Supreme Court uphold them? You know, there is precedent. We've talked about on the show in the early 2002, the General Assembly and State Court drew districts that were unconstitutional. They drew them again that were unconstitutional, and the court drew them one time. So I think the General Assembly has to be careful. If they still gerrymander them unconstitutionally, the court's not going to give them another chance. I think the court will draw the districts.
What criteria would they have? We understand they can't racially gerrymander.
Yes, they can. They have to, as a matter of fact. They're required by the Voting Rights Act to gerrymander the districts by race.
They just can't stack them and pack them.
They can't do it as much as apparently someone thinks. This is where they have a problem, Tom. They can't take race too much into account, and they can't ignore race. They have to be somewhere in between that is ill-defined, so we'll see. But I think what they will do is they will simply follow the same path they did for the congressional maps, which was the same issue. They responded with new maps that were still partisan gerrymanders, but they didn't look as squiggly. They were frankly better maps, and the racial components weren't as prominent. I think that's what they'll do for the
Howard, do you
legislature.
have as much of a problem or as much heartburn with political gerrymandering as you do with racial gerrymandering? Is that a loaded question?
Well, it is, but at the same time, I think both are very damaging and make me very uncomfortable. But if I had to come down on one side or the other, I certainly would go against racial gerrymandering, because many of the blacks who are voting certainly are going to vote Democratic, and that's the same thing. You're trying to accomplish the same end.
One way or another. Right. When we come back after this break, we're going to talk about North Carolina's economic U-turn.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
In 2011, our farmers asked for 6,500 seasonal workers. Only 7 Americans showed up to work those jobs. Immigrant farm workers aren't stealing American jobs. To say otherwise ignores the facts. When farmers don't have enough skilled workers, crops go unharvested and farmers lose money. Consumers face fewer choices and higher prices. This is not acceptable. Tell Congress it's time to fix our broken immigration system.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
NC State's professor of economics Mike Walden is a voice we often listen to regarding our state's economy. Mike recently wrote a column saying that it appears to be taking a U-turn in North Carolina. He specifically says that both per capita income and per capita earnings are declining, especially as compared with the nation as a whole. Chris, Walden says we're above the national average in creating high-paying jobs and similarly in lower-paying jobs, but we are actually below the nation in middle-income jobs. What's causing this phenomenon?
Well, first of all, I think that's what a lot of people have been feeling in North Carolina for a long time. I don't think it's new. I think that when we were hearing about the Carolina comeback, we were looking at broad statistics. But I think people around the state were knowing they were working longer, they were taking part-time jobs, they were doing all these things because they couldn't make as much money if they were middle-class workers. Part of the reason we've relied forever on traditional industries, furniture, tobacco, textiles, those were high-paying jobs in factories, and those middle-class jobs where you could support a family on one earner often. Those jobs have gone increasingly overseas or have become obsolete because of technology, which is actually even a bigger problem. We never figured out how to address that issue, and there are ways to do it. I think we need to make a lot more investments in things like broadband and helping rural communities, but we haven't done that.
John, you studied this quite a bit and have written
And I
on
looked
it.
at Mike's study.
Yeah, and so how can we have what you have reported on this show before to be a growing, sort of vibrant economy, maybe not as rapid as it did in the 90s,
right?
And yet at the same time, Mike Walden's saying we're doing a U-turn.
Well, they're completely consistent. We're looking at the same data and drawing the same conclusions. His argument is, and he's right, obviously. By the way, this is a trend that has nothing to do with the current political scrum. This is something that's almost 2 decades of data looking back in time. And what he's looking at is this middle layer of employment going away. It is largely a manufacturing story, though not entirely. And it is largely a technology story, not necessarily a trade story. At the same time, North Carolina's been doing a little bit better than the national average on most of the measures, a little bit better than the regional average on most of the measures, but definitely not as robust a rate of growth as we had in the 80s and the 90s. It's a change. I think we'll get through the change, and just as other states have gone through these kinds of changes, Howard, but it's been difficult.
Howard, the one thing that just becomes glaringly obvious for all of these reports is that the economy in our urban areas and even our ex-urban areas, shoulder counties, doing very, very well, while rural counties are just really having a tough time. And this report underscored that. You see any help, any hope for these rural areas?
Well, I think until we actually get serious on improving infrastructure in the rural area and recognizing that in order to get companies to relocate in some of these outlying areas, we got to have strong infrastructure, we have to have good schools, and we have to have housing stock that people would love to live in.
Connie, we talked in the last segment about economic incentives. Is this a place where we ought to just shoot a rifle shot along the lines of saying to people, to businesses that create middle income jobs, you'll get our incentives? Maybe those that are the higher paying jobs or the lower paying jobs won't get as much in incentive money?
You know, I think that's one possibility that could be out there to try to structure it. There's been a lot of effort over the years to increase the incentives to go to rural areas, high unemployment areas. And the problem is it's not just, you know, you improve the schools there, but if you don't have roads going there, if you don't have a hospital there, all of a sudden, you know, we've got areas of the state that are healthcare deserts.
Right.
And so it's more than just the jobs that we're looking at.
What's the panel going to tell us we don't know? After these messages, we're going to ask them.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Now we come to one of our favorite parts of the show when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Howard Lee, I'll start with you.
Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, we as a nation were making really good progress in student performance in academics. Unfortunately, I'm seeing reports now that are showing we're either flatlining or we are declining in math and in science.
Is this nationwide or just in state North Carolina?
Our nations, and it's having some effect for some reason in some foreign countries. But North Carolina and Texas were always the two leading states in terms of growth. And we both are struggling. Both states now are starting to struggle. Now, I think I have an answer for that. There are a lot of students who are leaving the conventional public schools that are tested in many of these programs, but the privates and the charters and some of the others are not tested as a part of this. So we're getting a bleed off of students, we're getting a bleed off of resources, and we start programs like the Innovative School District that, again, pulls out resource. I'm concerned. Margaret Spellins wrote an article 4 years ago calling attention to this, and like me, she really was cautioning us to be more careful about what's happening.
John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, we talked about a number of bills that passed. A bill that didn't pass, it passed one chamber but didn't pass the other, was something that the State Treasurer, Dale Falwell, and others are pushing, creating a solvency fund, a formal solvency fund to start accumulating assets to pay off the unfunded liabilities we have in our pension plan and our retiree health plan. It's not the whole solution, as we've talked about on the show before. You'd have to put many, tens of billions of dollars in this fund in order to truly offset the liability, but we need to start saving in that fund now. And Dale's argument is that the bond rating agencies would appreciate a dedicated fund to this purpose, and I think the legislature ought to get on with it.
When Dale Falwell gets on a case like this, things are going to happen. I'll predict that. Chris Fitzsimon, tell us something we don't know.
Well, to follow on Senator Lee's comments, I was disappointed that the final budget didn't include a new accountability measure for our voucher program, as the funding continues to go up every year, and I think it's going to reach $135, $140 million in the next 10 years. The House passed a bill to require voucher schools to take the Iowa test, so at least we'd have some measure of how they're doing, all of them. The Senate did not have that in the budget, and the Senate won out in the final calculation. So we really don't know how kids in voucher schools are achieving compared to traditional public school students.
Connie, tell us something we don't know.
Well, one of my clients is the Ready Mix Association, and we are excited because Duke Energy last week just announced their third beneficial reuse project to have another high-risk site that's going to be reusing coal ash.
Wow. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. Stay informed all during the week. Give your feedback and read my weekly column. Be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Join us next week when we're going to have a special show featuring millennials from 4-H in more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing